Hello.
That was an awesome
And we
session.
have another one from
Hello.
the Netherlands, right?
We're taking
Netherlands
over the
Day.
world, I'm sorry.
No, we're trying to fix all the time zones to accommodate the time zones a little bit better, so people don't have to get up at the middle of the night to give
That's
a
the only
session.
problem with online conferences, the fact that it can be that you're speaking at any time of the day. I think the worst I've had was starting at 12:30 in the morning, which was a shock for my body. I don't do 12:30 in the morning. And when the alarm went off at 5:30 in the morning, it was a double shock.
Oh, that's horrific.
Yeah, not the best. Not the best. Gosh.
Yeah, but
Well,
it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
we're the one who should say thank you.
Yeah.
We are so happy to have you here. Yeah. Oh, we got a comment. Look at that. Like your background shelf. Yes,
you
with the
so
Legos
much.
and
This is
lot of
my
cool
first
stuff.
talk with my new background. It's
really?
I set it up a couple of weeks ago, and
Nice.
it's the first time it's actually going out. I'm considering it's only 2 IKEA shelves and 1 Philips light. I am so happy with the result.
Okay. Nice.
yeah, it is. I think it's Kallax.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
It's
See?
like with a little bit of a modification to get kind of some bigger shelves for the.
Oh, right,
model.
right.
That's smart.
It's not supposed to be like that. It's a little bit weaker than it should be, but for the top shelf, it's fine.
As long as you don't put the Titanic on the top shelf, then you should be safe, right?
yeah, and
That's
for
gonna be
everyone.
fine, 'cause that's going to be sitting here at some point in the future.
Wow. So for anyone who's not into Lego, the Titanic is humongous and
So it's
probably
1.3 meters wide, 15 kilograms, something like that.
Yeah.
9,090 bricks.
yeah.
I'm not a
it's
Lego geek
huge.
at all.
No,
Not at all.
no,
No.
not at all. I've never heard of this Lego.
What is that?
I don't know.
It's a good way to spend all of your money.
It definitely
Yep,
is.
yep.
That is so true. Yeah, if you ever have too much money, get into Lego and that will
Completely.
sort itself out.
Yeah.
Ask us how we know.
I want a new McLaren F1 car.
Oh,
They
yes.
announced.
That looks fantastic. That's on my shopping list.
I figured.
I like how it's not on your bucket list or on your wish list. It's on your shopping list.
It's
That's
on
how
my
you do
shopping
it.
list. No, that's going to happen before the summer, I'm sure.
It's not released yet, so otherwise I guess it had been there.
Uh-huh.
That's awesome. We should remind everyone that we still have raffling going on, or raffling? Is it called
I don't
raffling?
know.
We have a raffle
So, yeah.
going on. So by simply either getting a ticket on Eventbrite, and you can find the link on our webpage, you can get one raffle ticket, and also by using the hashtag .NET Frontend on Twitter, and you get more raffle tickets.
And as per usual, ask questions in the chat and we'll bring them up during the Q&A.
Yeah,
But now I think
it's time.
the stage is yours, Stacy.
Yeah, take it
Yeah,
away.
thank you very much. So, hello, whatever time of the day it is, wherever you are watching from. Thank you so much for joining me to take a look at authentication in Azure Static Web Apps. Now, since they've been released, I have become a huge fan of these things because I see them as a really quick, a really simple way to get our applications out to the web. Inside of one single Azure resource, we have our front-end application in whatever static format you want. It can be Angular, it can be React. We're going to be looking at Blazor today. And then we have a back-end API using Azure Functions and some glue that exists only in that Azure resource to turn it into one coherent, useful application. And part of that code, part of that glue, is the authentication process. For the free tier, out of the box, we get a number of providers made available to us. And they're implemented in such a way that even if you're not an authentication expert, you can get this into your application quickly and simply. Now, for the standard tier, that's a tier that you have to pay about $10 a month for, something like that. You can even roll your own authentication provider, which is useful if you're writing a bigger application in an enterprise. We're not going to be looking into that today, I'm afraid, but be aware it exists. It can be quite useful. So, I'm Stacy Cashmore. I am Tech Explorer DevOps at Omniplan, a financial advice software provider based in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. I have been writing software since around the mid-1990s, and for the last 2 years, I've been honored to be able to call myself a Microsoft MVP in developer technologies. Now, enough with the boring stuff. Let's have a look at this in action. So, the application that we're going to be using today looks kind of like most Blazor applications that use scaffold out of the box. If you've ever done that before, I'm sure you recognize this, with just a couple of differences. The first one is, at the top, we have this auth provider saying, you are not logged in right now, which is good because I'm not. And then we have this little login button at the side, and that's just to take us to a page where I've got links to the different providers available to us. So out of the box, we can log in with Microsoft, or more accurately, we can log in with Azure Active Directory. We can log in with GitHub. We can log in with Twitter. Preview Google is available in preview right now, and not on this page, but also in preview is Facebook. It's not on the page because you have to be a member of the team to be able to get that working. I'm not, so I've not got it here. What does this do? Well, behind each of these links, there is a page which doesn't exist in my solution at all. It only exists inside of that Azure Static Web App resource. And to show you where it goes to, I'm going to do this manually and hope I don't make a typo. Aha, I already have it available here. And we go to a .auth folder. This is where all of the authentication takes place inside of an Azure Static Web App. And like I say, this is not my code. I can't break this, and I love any code that I can't break. So if we click on this, we go to Twitter. I authenticate in Twitter. I come back to my application, it reloads. And there we are. We now have an authentication provider of Twitter. And my login button is changed to say that I'm a standard user because I have no special rights right now. And none of the code to actually get that authentication working comes from me. I think that is kind of a huge amount of the power of authentication using static web apps, authentication in static web apps. To see what's available to you, there's also this .auth/me page. And if we go here, what we get out of it is a client principal with a little bit of information about the person that's logged in. So I logged in using Twitter, so that's my identity provider. We have a user ID, and this is my user ID inside of this Azure Static Web App. I'm not doxing myself here. In every static web app I log in, I will get a different user ID. Then I have my user details, and this is the information that the authentication provider returns to the Azure Static Web App. This is different depending on the provider you use. For Azure Active Directory and for Google, you get an email returned. For Twitter and for GitHub, you get the user ID returned, your handle. And then finally, we get the user roles available to us. And because I don't have any special rights, I just get the two standard ones inside of an Azure web app, and that is anonymous and authenticated. Using this, we can now use our user, or we can use our user details inside of the application, and we can do those other bits that we just saw on the front end, if the page loads again, with our provider and our button, just, using that data. Now, there is, as we say in Dutch, an addertje onder het gras here. We have a problem. All of this code only exists inside of that Azure Static Web App. What happens when I'm debugging locally and I want to be able to use this? I've not written this code. It's not available to me. How can I get it working? Well, thankfully, in order to help us develop static web apps, there was released in preview last year a Static Web App CLI. And what this does is replicate the Azure Static Web App resource on your local machine so you can work with it. I'm not going to talk too much about the CLI here because that is literally a talk all on its own. But what I do want to just say quickly is when I say replicate, I mean that it makes it look like you've got one running locally. It isn't the same. This is a Node.js service which just pretends to be a static web app. It sounds kind of semantics, but there are some differences. So always make sure you test in Azure before you go live if you're using this. So we're going to run this application locally now, and we're going to run our project, our API functions, and then the Static Web App CLI is going to glue everything together and make it look like we have this resource available to us. Now, this is always fun because my machine's decided to go on a complete go slow this afternoon. It was fine this morning, but it knew I was giving a talk this afternoon. So let's hope that it builds this quickly enough. Yes, there we go. We get this URL available to us, localhost 4280. And this is where we can now access our code. Let's bring that into the browser. And if we go here, we see something which is remarkably similar to what we have in production, which is good because it's the same application. And it just allows us to do our local debugging, our local checks. And because we're using this CLI, it gives us all of this login information. I can now log in with Twitter. But that looks a little bit different. And it looks a little bit different because running locally, we don't authenticate with Active Directory, with Google, with Twitter, with GitHub. We actually fake that authentication process because it all gets turned into that client principal anyway. So we don't need to go out to these external things. We can set a user ID, a username, and our user roles. And you know what? I'm going to give myself admin role because why not? And then we can test locally. So if I log in now, my application now thinks that I have logged in using Twitter, and it doesn't know any difference about what I'm doing. If I go to that .auth/me, different format because it's running on the CLI, but we still get this client principal returned to us with our user ID, which we entered, the user roles that we have available. So here's our admin role, and the user details and identity provider as we had before. Interestingly, I think I saw that the login button still said standard user and it's admin. So we'll have to have a look at that in a couple of minutes. Using these providers inside of the development environment, I absolutely adore because I now no longer need to have a test account in every single one of these providers in order to work. I don't have to go to the bureaucracy of getting different roles added and removed from test accounts in order for me to work. And if I want to change my roles on the fly, you just saw that I added admin, I can do that. If I need to share a user between my team, we only need to share the user ID so that everybody can access the same information. We no longer need to share test accounts with username and passwords. So it just makes life that little bit easier for us. This is something that I adore. So let's have a look at how we actually managed to get this authentication provider and this standard user on the page. How do we get that into Blazor? Well, it starts off in the program CS file when we're adding the services to our application. And we're going to add this static web app authentication. Now, I got this code originally, I've changed it a little bit, but I got this code originally from a repo from Anthony Chu. And I'm going to put a link in Twitter after this talk so that you can go to the original repo and see what he did too. Now, inside of this static web app authentication, if my machine does something, come on, you can do it. We do two things. We add an authorization core, which just comes from the ASP.NET Components authorization namespace. And then we add an authentication state provider. This is where the magic happens. And for that, we are using this static web app authentication state provider. And this does two things. The first thing it does is get the client principal that we want to use to authenticate our user. And it gets that from that .auth/me endpoint. This application's Blazor WebAssembly. It's running in the browser. When we make that call to .auth/me, we're sending the cookies along with it, and we can get this data back and use it. Once we've got this
Stacy,
data, yeah?
Is it
Hello?
possible for you to enlarge the font?
I can indeed.
Oh, thank you so
Sweet.
much. Sorry about
Yeah.
that.
No problem. It's people need to be able to read it, otherwise it's kind of just me talking. Once we're in here, the next thing that we need to do is turn this client principal, which is the format used inside the static web app, and turn it into a claims principal. So we have another piece of code for that. And what we do here, we strip out that anonymous user role. And we do that because if someone's got anonymous, it doesn't really affect anything. We assume everybody is anonymous. If that's the only role that they've got, then we return an empty claims principal. We don't class them as authorized, and we continue as though nobody's logged in. If they do have roles left over, then we make this claims identity. So we pass in the identity provider, which is either going to be AAD, GitHub, Twitter, or Google. We pass in the name identifier for the user ID, that one that comes from the static web app. And then we pass in the user details into the claims type name, which always strikes me as odd because it's not a name. It's either going to be an email or a handle. And then we just add all of the roles that that user has so we can use it in our application. Now, as far as the static web app authentication process goes, this is it. This is where it ends, because from now on, we just use the same kind of authentication that we'd use in Blazor normally. So if we go to our, can I find it, our app.razor page, we add this cascading authentication state. If we add that around our router, then that means we can use this authentication in each one of our components. And in fact, I'm using it in two places. I'm using it in the main layout where I have this authorized view. And if I'm authorized, then I'm just showing the identity provider. So identity authentication type. If you're not logged in, then I just display not logged in. And the other place I'm using it is in the nav menu to change that button. So if you're logged in, then I point you to the logout if you click on the button. And I give you a standard user and super user, not admin, super user. That's why that one needs changing. So we can just get the user claims the same way that we normally would. It's no different to any other Blazor application. That's on the client side. On the API side, we also need to get information about people. If I'm logged in and I'm trying to access data, I should only access data which is associated with me. If I'm trying to edit data or update data, then I also want to know that it's me that's done the updating and check that everything's going as it should. In order to do that, inside of our Azure function, we still use this client principle. We only get it in a slightly different way. So we use this XMS client principle header out of the request. Now, I love this because this header doesn't exist coming from the site to the Azure Static Web App. When you're logged in, your cookie is checked by the Static Web App, and this is added to the request as it goes to your function. And as your function is not available to the outside world, it's only available inside of that Azure Static Web App, it means that we can use this in order to validate somebody's authentication status. Once we have this client principle, we decode it in literally exactly the same way. This is the same code as before. So exactly the same as we do on the front end, we can now use it inside of our function. And well, in this demo, all I'm literally doing is just stripping out what's inside of that claims principle, returning it to the front end, just so we can see what's happening. If you want to stop people doing things inside of this API, well, you can do that here using the roles, because you can still check somebody has the right role. Are they an admin? If not, you can return an unauthorized. But there's a better way of doing it for the API, and that is to use the static web app config file. Now, this is also kind of a talk on its own. You can do an awful lot with this. Right now, we're just going to concentrate on these top 3 rows. We've set up several routes inside of our application. Authentication test, you need to be a super user to access authentication test. You need to be authenticated to use authentication test 2. And just because, you know what, in that Blazor app, that counter functionality is so awesome, I think you need to be authenticated in order to use that one as well. By setting up here again, you are putting the Azure Static Web App in between, and that is managing the access to your resources so that you don't have to inside your code. Again, it's less code that you can do wrong. So let's have a look at that one in action inside of our app. Now, I'm logged in here as a standard user. So in theory, let's do it on our local host. In theory, if I go to the authentication test, I get a 401 unauthorized. This is what we wanted to see. If I go to authentication test 2, I get access, I get my data back. And if I go to counter, that one works because I'm authorized. So if I log out and I try to come back in, and if I don't type wrong things, it works. That's odd. That shouldn't work. I've obviously done something wrong somewhere. There we go. Helps if you use the right URL. So I now get my unauthorized. There's something to be careful of here, though. I've set this up inside of the Static Web App, but I'm running a Blazor app inside of the browser. Once it's loaded, it never goes back to that Static Web App. So I can still come here, and I can still use it. If you are using this, make sure that you protect your Blazor application itself. It's running in the browser. Trust nobody. So that's how we can limit access to our application. Let's just go in. Let's just prove that we can use the super user. Let's change this admin. Go to super user and log back in. And again, this is what I love about working on this inside of the CLI. I can just change the role that I've got on a whim to see what happens. And then we load. And now if I try and come down to this authentication test, ta-da! It works as we expect. So there's one more thing that I want to show before we actually look at the how you set roles inside of the Static Web App itself when you want to use them. And that is our providers. All of these things are available out of the box. Now, it might be that you're building an app which is heavily integrated with Twitter, with GitHub, and that's the only authentication that you want to be able to use. There is a way to stop this. And again, it's by using that static web app config file. And that would be this line here. As I said, all of these pages, they're available inside of the Azure Static Web App, but you can also set the routes to return 404 when you go to a certain place. So inside of my app, I've decided that I'm not going to be using Azure Active Directory. And so if I try and log in with Microsoft, I get a 404 not found. On the free tier, this is useful to limit the authentication providers that you want to use. If you are writing an enterprise application and you've got your own authentication process that you need to follow, obviously you can do this for all of the providers and make sure that people can only log in with the provider that you want to use. So one last thing to talk about, and that is how to add the roles inside of our app. Now, let's go and log out of our production application. Come on, you can do it. Thank you. And if we go to the Azure portal, inside of the resource itself, we have this role management available to us. Inside of this page, we can we can add 25 users, which doesn't sound much. But these 25 users are only needed for when you want special roles. You may notice I logged in with Twitter and I'm not here. So it's literally only if you need a special role that you need to do this. So I think for most applications, certainly if you're on the free tier, this is probably going to be good enough. If you've got a bigger organization, if you need to give more people special access to your website, then you can go to the paid tier. And if you do that inside of this role management, you can then add 25 users, which kind of sounds the same. And honestly, I have no idea why, but on the paid version, as opposed to the free version, using this role management, you can only have 25 users. What is different in the paid version is you can roll your own authentication, which means that you can set up an Azure function, a special Azure function, and that can handle all of the authentication process for you, including the role management. And at that point, it's unlimited. So how do we add somebody into the free tier here? It's actually amazingly easy. If we click on this invite button, you get to pick the authentication provider that you want to use. So Active Directory, GitHub, that Facebook preview I was talking about, Twitter, and Google in preview. We're going to be adding a GitHub user, and it's going to be Stacy Cash. And I want to give Stacy Cash that super user role. When I do that, I get an invite link that I can send out to people. I'll copy that to the clipboard and paste it in. I need to grant consent to the application to use my GitHub information. And now when I load, I'm this super user. I am using GitHub. And if I go to that auth.me, you can now see that I have this super user role available to me, and I can use the app. It is that easy to add people. Few things that you need to be aware of when you do this. There is an amount of caching that goes on. The reason why I didn't use my Twitter user for this demonstration is because if I do that, it takes about 10-15 minutes before it becomes active. I didn't want to wait those 10-15 minutes. I wanted it to happen instantly. So that's why I used my GitHub account. Same goes for when you're changing roles. If I was to remove super user or add a different role right now, because I've just logged in with that GitHub user, every time I log in, it's going to be using those roles that are cached, and it takes a bit of time to catch up. It's not necessarily a problem, but you need to be aware of it. So there we are. That was kind of a very quick lightning tour of how we can use authentication inside an Azure Static Web App, certainly using the free tier. We've taken a look at the different providers that are available out of the box, what information is available to us, and how to use that inside of a Blazor application and from the API. We've had a look at the Static Web App config file so that you can limit access either to routes inside of your application or to different providers so that you can only allow users to log in using the provider that you want. And we've had a very quick look in the portal to see how to add users and get them into your site. Like I say, this has been an absolute whirlwind tour. I hope it's piqued your interest. If it has, then I really suggest that you take a look. There's amazing documentation available on the MS Doc site. I'm going to be posting some links on Twitter shortly about the quotas for the roles, about the authentication process itself, and like I say, to Anthony Chu's repo, where he sets up the authentication. I'm also going to be making the repo that I was just demonstrating public, but that's probably going to take a few days before that's there. I'll tweet when it's available. I've been Stacy Cashmore. I hope you have a fantastic rest of the day. It's been great to be here. And thank you to my computer for not stopping halfway through, which I was really afraid it was going to. Thank you all.
Thank you, Stacy.
Thank you, Stacy. So I personally get a little bit scared when it comes to authentication.
Yes.
So when you deep dived into all of this, did you become less scared or more scared?
I became less scared because it is... I think the scary bits are hidden from you here, which is cool. I mean, I always say the best password that you can store is not to store a password. And I don't want to be responsible for other people's security information. So just having this authentication process available to me just really helps that. And I'm not an authentication expert. It's something that, you know, you've got those lists of things that you know that you need to dive into, but you never have time to do. This is one of those things for me. And yet I can still get this up and running in a way that I'm not scared to actually use. So yeah, authentication is scary, but this kind of takes the edge off.
But isn't it a little bit scary not to know what is actually happening? Because you really need to have this right.
Or do you have a control issue?
Maybe. Probably.
I can go with your control issue, but at the same point, if I'm writing the code to make this happen, I can make mistakes. And this way,
definitely.
it is people who are far better than me that have implemented this glue inside of the resource. And so I am happy to hand over that control to them because they can do a better job of it than I can.
That makes sense.
With Azure Static Web Apps, is it possible to use, like for example, Azure AD B2C if you want to have the option to have passwords and user accounts, but without having to build that service yourself?
You know what? I've not tried that one yet. I don't know what... I mean, if you log in with AAD, then I'm assuming... But I say, I've not tried it. I will try this evening. I'm going to try it with my own password, and I'm going to see what happens there.
Okay.
But it's not one that I know out of the box. But I can't imagine it wouldn't work because it's still going through Azure Active Directory, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's the same client library, so I guess will work then. So,
but I'm going to make a note of that one, and I am going to try it later and get back to you.
thank you.
Just quickly.
So
start
Denny
writing
has a
stuff
question for you. Did you think about having demo apps with all your Lego stuff?
That would be cool.
No, she did.
This needs to be done.
It does need to be. I'm always torn though because it's a lot of the demos that I give. If I need to use, data in my demos, I generally go down the Doctor Who route rather than the Lego route.
I think I know that someone has Doctor Who Lego. Problem solved.
Combination.
Exactly. See, it's right there.
I have no idea what you mean.
So the question is the Lego box actually big on the inside?
Yeah. I
Now
think
we're
the Lego
totally
box is
nerding out.
bigger on the inside. Absolutely. You open that Lego box and a whole world comes to you.
Oh,
Ooh,
nice.
I cannot understand how code can be hosted only in external hosts. How? Not sure I understand the question.
No, I'm not sure what that means. Maybe you can add a little bit of an explanation to that?
Let's keep a lookout.
Yeah, let's grab some more. Is this also available for Maui?
I don't think so. Not unless you can use Maui to write Azure Static Web Apps, but I don't think you can.
Fair enough.
Gerald, if you're still in the chat, maybe you can answer that one.
Is it free for all or not?
It's free for all. It's you need to have an Azure account, obviously. But if you're using the standard tier, then it's free. I think if you have a really popular site and you go absolutely overboard with the amount of API requests, then you might get some Azure Function charges incurred, I think. But I don't think it's something that most people are going to notice.
So make sure to check where you set your level of spending on the Azure site before.
Yeah.
Ask me how we know.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Ask me how I know.
I don't have that many visitors to my site, but I've been running this for over a year now in production, and I've never had to pay anything.
And there's no special app plan that you have to have?
Nope. There's no special app plan. It is literally when you create the Azure resource. Maybe I can ever so quickly show you. Let's have a look here. Come on, give me a resource group so I can make a new resource. Seriously, my machine has been so speedy all day, and then literally like 10 minutes before the talk, Windows Search Index decided to steal all of my CPU, and it won't let go.
Every single time.
And you can't even kill it.
Not...
Every time you kill the process, it comes back. But yeah, here we go. When you create a new resource, come on, you can do this, little computer. It is literally a thing on its own here. So you create a static web app, and that's it. This is all that you need. It's one resource. And what's even cool is with your standard app service or web apps, you need to have a completely unique name inside of Azure. And for a static web app, you don't. You can choose whatever name you want because it makes up the
Nice.
URL for you based on different things. If you create it from
Nice.
GitHub, you also get CI/CD out of the box, which is something else that I really adore.
That's great.
That's sometimes the hardest thing. Otherwise,
Yeah.
coming up with a unique name.
Naming is hard.
Yeah.
Naming is hard, especially when you have to be unique with every other person in the world using Azure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you mentioned custom providers. Are there any limitations or restrictions? For example, can we use a custom OAuth provider?
If you can write it, you can use it. It's you have to provide data back to the static web app in a certain way. I've not done that yet. That's next on my list. But you just need to use, I think it's an OpenID. Don't quote me on that, but OpenID Connect, something like that. It's a standard way of communicating, so you can use it with Identity Server, all those types of things. It's not limited to certain things. It is a custom one, but you have to make it available.
Right. So how easy is it to use the auth providers with a custom-built login page so that the app doesn't have to go through the provider page and back again? Is that even possible?
No. You've got to go through the authorization providers because the Azure Static Web App, which is running on the server, that needs to do the work. And then you need to reload your Blazor application in order to get that authentication information. It comes in on the startup, so you need to reload the page. What you can do, you can set a return URL so that if you log in from a certain page, you always go back to that page, but you do need to make that round trip.
So do you miss showing off your dresses during presentations?
Absolutely 100%. It's, I got changed into the dress today, but yeah, you can only kind of see this much of me. You can't see the rest of it.
So why do we need to wait around 15 minutes for Twitter account regarding authentication?
Okay, it's not around the Twitter account that you need to wait. I possibly worded that badly. That is caching that happens inside of the static web app itself. So what it is, if I have already logged in with an account and then I either add or remove a role and I log in again straight away, it takes a few minutes for that cache to be refreshed inside of the Azure Static Web App before it's available. So if I'd have done this the other way around, if I'd have logged in with GitHub straight away, and then I'd have added the Twitter account as a super user, that would have been instant. It's just with the account that's just been logged in that you have to wait on.
Oh, makes sense. Perfect talk, Stacy. Will there be a solution for custom auth with just normal email addresses for Blazor Azure Static Web Apps?
Again, if you want to implement it. It's if you are using Identity Server and you store the usernames and passwords of your users directly inside of there, then you can connect that up and make it work.
Or then you maybe can go for the Azure AD B2C solution that you will try out this evening.
How do you inspect the payload from a third-party auth provider?
Honestly, I have no idea because I've never needed to.
And the question is, why do you want to? That's kind of the thing, right? What you're talking about. It just works.
Yeah, it just works. It makes it simple, and there's nothing you can do with it anyway, because that payload from the third party, it is only used for authentication. It's not used for authorization. All of the authorization happens inside of the Azure Static Web App.
So you will not get any data about the users.
Nope.
For example, email address.
You only get the information that that you saw on that .auth/me page. So
you're not able to define scopes, for example, what type of data you want in the payload.
No.
Okay.
So from a game that hates Windows sometimes, you can pause indexing from indexing options.
That's a nice tip.
Please,
Sounds like black
please,
magic.
Please send me a tweet with that information. I need to know.
Yeah. Well, some things. It's the same with OneDrive.
Yeah.
Sometimes it hogs all of the memory on your computer and it won't let go, but you can pause that one too.
Yeah.
I like pausing stuff.
Yeah. Right, we are on time, I believe.
Yes.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me again. And I say I'm going to post those links in Twitter, and I'm going to be looking at the YouTube and Twitch chats for the next 10, 15 minutes or so. So if there's something you want to ask away. And if I can answer, I will. And if not, I'll try and find somebody who can answer it for you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
You too.